So let's get started. Adopting, pause, a new way. Let's imagine a scenario. Your colleague comes and tells you that they've had a baby girl. What's your instant reaction? Another scenario. A peer comes and tells you that they've become a parent through adoption. What's your instant reaction? For most part, and for most people in scenario one, it would be, "How lovely, so cute, congratulations." And perhaps in the second scenario, more tentative, more cautious. "Wow, what a noble deed. What a good man you are." Sometimes an awkward silence, and followed by a congratulations. These are some of the responses that come up, and that's the status quo I'd like to reimagine. Now let's look at the evolution of adoption through history. Firstly, let's understand the reasons for and attitudes to adoption have been over time. Unlike today's modern mindset, which is altruism, nobility, charity, and giving back to society, the origins of adoption were very practical. It was all about inheritance and the need of an heir. I'll give you an example. During the 6th century AD, under Roman law, when a male patriarch was poised to die without a male heir, an heir could be provided from another family through adoption, since wealth and power had to stay in the paternal line, and daughters were seldom adopted. Let's look at the parallels in India around the same time. The concept of adoption has existed here in our country from time immemorial. It's common for sages and kings to adopt a male child to succeed them, again, to keep the wealth, the legacy within the circle. And another reason to adopt a male child would be to perform the last rites during funerals. Another practical reason? We've heard of stories in our epics and mythology across the world about adoption. The birth of Karna, the birth of Moses, and the birth of Krishna. So, while adoption and the concept of adoption has existed throughout history, it was not really smooth always. Let's look at the Middle Ages in Europe. French, Italian, and the English common law outrightly rejected adoption. They forbade adoption. What was the shift in policy? Inheritance was again redefined to include only those related by blood. Now, where did the children go? What happened with children? We know that throughout history, right, we've seen abandoned and orphaned children. It's illuminating to see how societies and people have dealt with them over centuries. Again, in today's adoption ecosystem, the belief is that every child needs a home. However, this is an incredibly modern concept. Let's look at societies, for example, where children were placed in systems like indentured servitude or pauper apprenticeship contracts. What happened here? Authorities would legally bind these children to wealthy families and masters, supposedly to provide them with some skills to sustain them after they come of age. That seldom happened. They were put to work most of the time, perhaps with no wages, and sometimes the children met with harsh treatment. There was another practice in Europe called oblation. Here, the surrendered children were adopted by churches and monasteries, and then the children would serve the particular order. Now, it became, when the numbers increased, the churches and monasteries couldn't manage them effectively, and this led to the idea of opening the first few orphanages in Europe. When did this child-centric approach happen in the world, in our societies? Perhaps coming to the early 20th century, when the most brutal events have had surprisingly a benevolent effect on adoption. The world wars altered the adoption practices, especially followed World War I, when the illegitimate births and orphans increased. This rise prompted Europe, Western Europe, and United States to look at their child welfare practices and tweak the adoption laws, thus leading to a very significant change in mindset and prioritizing that every child requires a family and it's crucial for their development. Now, post-World War II, we saw a dramatic increase of international adoptions. Okay? Again, influenced by poverty, wars, natural disasters, human rights issues. Thousands of children were adopted from countries like Vietnam, Guatemala, South Korea, China by families in Western Europe and United States. Again, adoption being redefined at this point in time, or reframing it as something as seen as rescuing poor children from their dire circumstances and thus strengthening the nobility of adoption. Now let's come back to India. What happened here around the same time? Yeah, the first act, it was in 1920, was a Children's Act which was enabled by the Madras and Bombay presidencies, giving the state the full responsibility to take care of the destitute and orphan children. Now, prior to 1970s, the Indian mindsets wouldn't allow to adopt a child of an unknown parentage. And if they did so, it was kept as a secret, as a family secret, again due to social stigma, including infertility and unknown parentage of the child. Now let's see what the current situations in adoption are today. Let's come back to the present. So the reasons have become more diverse, some things have changed, and some things have not. So that brings us back to the status quo. So what is the status quo? While factors like nobility, charity, infertility, medical reasons, altruism still hold good and remain good, moreover, biases around religion, ethnicity, caste, color still color people's mindsets. Adoption is sometimes seen as something to hide, to be shameful, and prejudices and biases just pop up toward children when things don't go smooth. So how are these biases expressed? It's supposedly very honest questions. How much did you pay? Where did the child come from? Do you know the background? Which religion did the child come from? Oh, he's looking so malnourished. Maybe you could have opted for a child who was fatter, chubbier, and fairer. Another filmy one. Was he found near the dustbin? And another one. She's so lucky, no, to have you. And the prejudice pop up quite easily in everyday interactions when things don't go smooth. A child or an adolescent's misbehavior. We can call it a tantrum, perhaps cheating, lying, everything attributed sometimes to lineage, must be the birth parents. If a child or an adolescent asserts their independence, making choices, then it would be seemingly very ungrateful to the society and to the parents. So, what is a reinvention that I like to see in adoption? What is a status quo that I like to shake up? It's adopting a new mindset. People adopt for a variety of reasons. Perhaps when the biological route doesn't work, adoption is an alternative option. For some, it stems from a desire to have a blended family unit, like having children through the adoption as well as through the biological space. Today, the young minds and the young adults, look at it as a first option. That's a welcome change. We have more single women and single male adopting children. Again, a welcome change. We'd like to see more of this happening, though. And there are children who are with special needs and older children. They deserve a family, too. I'd like to see some numbers there, too. What is the reinvention that I like to see around the language? Now, language and vocabulary is very important. It's very, very critical. So, what is it that I like to see? I'd like to add to how you approach adoption, that adoption is an event like birth. It's not a life sentence that hangs over a person for the rest of their lives. And here's what I mean and how it impacts the language and vocabulary. To quote a child through adoption, I wish my friends would not say, you are adopted. They don't say to my sister, you're biological. And there's a second part to it. So what's the second part? You were adopted or you are adopted. We don't go around saying, so you are born. And another example to quote, which was said to the child, hey, you don't look adopted at all. So how are these children supposed to look like? And another one, you're so special, you are adopted. Now that's the reinvention that I like to see in the language and the vocabulary and how we speak to children and the families. A birth parent is the parent. The child is the child. Was adopted and not is adopted. Child placed in adoption and not child given up for adoption. Another important aspect that I would like to add here is the adoption triad. So with the adoption triad, you have the child, the birth parent, as well as the parent by adoption. Now, both of them are integral to the child. It is part of their identity. Now, it's time to adopt a new mindset. Openness, inclusion, acceptance, and empathy. Now, if you're a person who's looking at adoption in the future, or you know someone that has adopted a child, or is keen on adopting, here are some takeaways that I have for you. Adoption is just a way to form a family, nothing less, nothing more. It's an equal relationship. The family gets to fulfill their parenting requirements, and the child's requirements are met through the family. The conventional approach of matching skin tone or physical attributes, it's very hard to do that. It's literally a skin-deep approach. However, the most important thing is the distinctions that you make in your mind and not the physical distinctions of physical attributes. Truly strong bonds are built over time with the parent taking care of the child and nurturing them. And that's how true bonds are built and families are built. We all come from deep conditioning. We all have our prejudices and biases. What's important to do is to reflect, to become more aware of our own biases and conditioning before we respond to the child or the family. Telling your child about adoption is crucial. It is their identity, part of their identity. It is their story. That's part of their reality. And it's their story to tell. An attitude of empathy and compassion rather than a savior mindset is healthy for the child's self-worth and emotional well-being. And to go back to how we started, a response that you may have and you want to have and you should have when you hear about a child's arrival in a family should be what? What should it be? Wow, beautiful, congratulations, let's celebrate together. I'd just like to add a note here that all legal adoptions happen through CARA, Central Adoption Resource Authority, which comes under the WCD, which is Women and Child Development Ministry, and I think it's our right and responsibility to encourage everybody who's looking at adoption to follow the legal process. It's about protecting the safety and rights of the child. This is just a snippet of the adoption ecosystem. The subject is broad, the concepts and nuances are vast. And I'd like to end by saying the change begins with me and you. And also to add that that is what the organization does, Padme Foundation, reinventing stories, changing mindsets, for parents to have a broader, inclusive, open mindsets. And that's the work we do every day with parents and children and public at large. Thank you.